down below. Some are muted, so they may have stepped away from their computer for a moment. But Karen, if you're ready, let's get started.
Yeah, I would like to say welcome to everybody who's joining us today. On behalf of, I'm a member of the Continuous Learning Subgroup for the Place-Based Justice Network. I'm been asked by my colleague Ross at Whitworth to say welcome to everybody. That's the subcommittee that is working on these Zoom calls, as well as in collaboration with others, the December gathering that's taking place. So I wanted to remind you that this fall, we're focusing on an exploration of our shared values in our Zoom calls. And the last time we had a Zoom call, we heard from Kent Koth of Seattle U and Jennifer Pigs of St. Mary's University, and they provided an overview of our values and how we came to draft them as a group. And today we're going to take a deep dive into our shared values. And these values matter as they inform our daily practice of justice with our community. And thank you, Erin. There's our values on the screen before you. One of the first values that folks in our network identified as central to our work is a commitment to anti-racist and anti-oppressive goals. And today we welcome AyeNay, Abye, and Erin Burrows of Seattle University to discuss intersectionality in our work, shifting our practice to critical community engagement. So we'll hear from AyeNay and Erin in a moment, but I want to ask you to be present and open to the possibility of deepening your understanding of the work we do and turn your focus, which I know is hard on a work day, and particularly sometimes at Zoom when we have other interruptions and emails that are pressing, that are tempting us beyond Zoom. We ask that you be fair to the developmental nature of our learning and of our respective community work. Some of us may be far along in this work, others may be embarking on this work. Our hope is certainly that we're all in a process around learning and deepening our understanding of these values. And then we want to mention that we work in community and that this group is really a meta community of folks who work in other communities, multiple communities. So bring the same spirit of humility and mutuality to our time that you bring to your community partners. So that said, I want to turn it over to our co-facilitators and just deeply appreciate what you're bringing today, because I am really, really excited about this content. It's deeply meaningful and really going to be a rich conversation today.
Thank you, Karen. For others that have joined us and are no longer on mute, do you want to say hello to the group?
Hi, it's Mary Laurel and Green from Augsburg University.
Great. Welcome.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yes.
Anne Marie Ryan from Loyola University Chicago.
Great. Welcome.
Tammy Shader from Seattle University.
Welcome, Tammy.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all as we meet virtually, but I also want us to acknowledge where we are currently sitting. As we talk over Zoom, we're also sitting in our place of work, our place of home. This past week was Indigenous Peoples Day here in Seattle, so we also want to acknowledge the first peoples of this land, the organizers, the community members, folks who have been doing community work for generations, folks who have done it named, unnamed. And so we belong to a rich history, each of us, where we're sitting right now. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the folks that you work with, the people that came before you. So we're going to take a couple of seconds to just acknowledge those folks. Thank you. For us, it's really important to be grounded in history and what we do. And as we go through our workshop today around intersectionality, we're really going to talk about not only what this means for us as individuals, but what this means about acknowledging the whole person, the whole community, the whole institution. And for us at Seattle U, you know, for me, I've been here 4 years. I'm now the deputy director here. And what drew me to the institution was care for the whole person, which is one of the values and major things in the Jesuit tradition. But also for Seattle U around living a just and humane world. I was brought to this because I thought, you know, in doing community engagement work, it's really important to acknowledge people and all of their identities. It's also really important for us to acknowledge our community in its wholeness. And so as we move through the day, or this morning presentation, Erin and I are going to be facilitating a discussion on really getting to the history of where this term intersectionality came from. Then we're going to talk about, you know, access of privilege, domination, and power, not only within our work, but within this issue around intersectionality and the acknowledgement of people for who they are, the work for what it is, and then talk about it and open up a discussion space. So we're really going to just spend about 10 minutes at the setup and then open it up to everybody on the call and on the Zoom computer. So I'm going to pass it over to Erin.
Hi, everyone. Many of you know me from different gatherings over the last couple years. I've been here at Seattle U since 2016, going into my third year here. And I'm really excited to facilitate this call specifically about intersectionality. It's a term that I've used liberally over the years. I've taught workshops on intersectionality to young people, both in high school and at the college level. I've created handouts. It's something that I use all the time in my personal community organizing work. And through preparing for this presentation, I actually learned quite a bit about how I was using the term incorrectly. Going back to Kimberly Crenshaw's original scholarship and realizing that as a white woman in the United States, I was actually deeply misinterpreting this idea. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I learned. We're going to kind of skim the surface of Kimberly Crenshaw's original intention, how it's been used broadly over the last few years, and what a popular sense of intersectionality is, but then really bring it home to what intersectionality means in terms of us as a network and as a learning community. All right. So with that, let's get started. So many of you will be familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw as the woman who coined this term. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar. She's also a critical race scholar and feminist. And as a Black feminist, she pulled together some of the legacy of Black women's activism in the United States to create a theory that really encompassed both her lived experience and the lived experience of other women of color that she works with. She started this work in the mid-'80s. And in 1991, she was actually on the legal team for Anita Hill during those hearings. And so, you know, she is active currently. You can see here on the screen, she's working at UCLA and Columbia Law School, and she's also engaged internationally on how the term is used and what intersectional justice means in our current world. I pulled up this definition from Merriam-Webster just to show that the term itself has really become part of our popular culture. Webster actually credits her. Right on this screen, you can see one of her quotes in defining what intersectionality means. And this idea that it's a greater than some idea for people who hold multiple marginalized identities. So for most of us, when we think about intersectionality, we're really thinking about the whole identity of a person as they enter any space. We're thinking about their race and their class, their gender, if they have disabilities, both visible and invisible. We're thinking about their age and their class background. I might have said that already. It's really a modern, or not modern, a broad and popular sense of what most people think of when they hear the term intersectionality. And that is absolutely valid and absolutely true. It's meaningful, I think, for a lot of people to look at themselves through an intersectional lens. But Kimberly Crenshaw really intended it to be a legal theory in which we could understand what it meant to hold multiple forms of marginalization and actually be blocked from civil rights because of those multiple forms of marginalization. So as we learn about civil rights movements from the 60s, 70s, and to today, you know, so often they're single issue movements. We think about, you know, Black liberation in one pocket. We think about feminism in another pocket. We think about LGBTQ rights and movements in another pocket. And this work really brings all of those conversations together, and specifically in the lived experience of bodies. I think that's a really important aspect of this. And I want to go to Kimberly Crenshaw's words. One of the biggest critiques that people have of this term, especially folks who are just learning about it, is that the work is not new. And so she did an interview in 2014, and I'm pulling from some of her quotes from that article. This is a long quote. I'm going to send out these slides later, so don't feel like you have to memorize this. But essentially, she speaks very openly about the fact that she's not the first person to think about this. She coined the term, but the idea and the lived reality of intersectionality has been present, certainly since the founding of our country, and looking at our complex history, and all the way up to those early 80s years when she was working on this scholarship. So just pointing out here that, in every political moment, there have been African-American women who articulated the need to think and talk about race through a lens that looks at gender, or think about feminism through a lens that looks at race. And that is really the roots and the origins of this term. And we really want to hold and honor Black feminism as the origin point for this entire idea. So going back a little bit to how it's been used in most spaces, I think many of us have probably filled out an identity wheel at some point in our histories before you ended up on this call. And if not, I'm going to show you an example of it in a moment. An identity wheel, I would say, is step one. And it's a crucial aspect of doing intersectional work, but it is not the big picture. And so I actually just recently did this exact worksheet at a retreat for a graduate program that I'm in currently. And it's all about the I and the me, really taking a moment to pause and think about what are the identities you hold and think about most often? What are identities you never think about? And what are ones that you would like to think about more? And then also thinking about what has the strongest effect is how you see yourself as a person, but also how other people perceive you. So as we look at this wheel and the categories here, some of this people will make assumptions about. Some of these are actually maybe secret or like extraordinarily private, including sexuality or disability status. The origins of our families are sometimes very complex when it comes to race and ethnicity. And so some of this is maybe more on the surface level, more visible, and others, we get to choose and disclose. And also some of these we have choices around and some we don't. So this model in of itself is complicated, and it's just the beginning.
Yes, we use this model in a training with our students. And for all of our students who are participating in the community, whether as volunteer, whether as an intern or paid employee, we use this to help students really reflect on their role in the community, which also means what is it that they're bringing, they're learning, and who are they? How do you start with yourself in order to better understand your community that you're a part of? So this has been really helpful in opening conversations with our students as well as with our staff, and really thinking about who are we, and what then does that mean for the collective?
Exactly. So we're going to send out these slides. If you have never done this exercise before, I recommend it. And we're going to talk about how to go a little bit deeper. So Kimberly Crenshaw acknowledges in that same interview back in 2014 that her entire goal was to come up with a common everyday metaphor. And I would say she has been wildly successful. If you are on social media, if you look up hashtag intersectionality, intersectional feminism, you're going to see an overwhelming amount of content of people who have connected with this idea. And that is really powerful. I think it's the goal of most academics to have their ideas saturate culture like that. But I want to point out how she expands it here in this quote. So it's all good to understand the discriminations that occur along one avenue or one axis point, but what does it look like when it flows into another axis point, another avenue? So what does it look like when someone holds the lived experience of multiple marginalized identities, multiple forms of oppression, and what does that do to their everyday life? So there's another diagram coming up that kind of starts to break that down a little bit more. It is mildly overwhelming, so warning, but we're going to talk about this as it applies to the place-based justice network. You can take it away.
Do you want to set up the image and then I'll talk about
Sure.
the actual?
Absolutely. Has anyone seen this image before? Let's just get a crowd. This is from 1996. Okay, great. I had actually never seen this specific one before, but I think it's pretty useful. And there's a lot of different versions of this.
It's great, Erin.
Heather, did you have something that?
Yeah, this is amazing.
Okay, great. So I'll just break down how it works a little bit. I think my cursor works. Can everybody see cursor?
Yeah.
Great. It's just a little plus sign there. So right here is domination. It's on the other side as well. So this bold line separates identity categories below and above the line. Below the line are categories that have been historically marginalized or oppressed. And we can break each one of these down and look at the history in a United States context in particular, or Canadian context for our folks who are above the border. And then above the line is our identities that have historically held more power and influence. So these are identities that have held, that have been privileged historically, and in most cases currently. I would say this is an accurate portrait of how power and privilege flows through these various identities today. And then if you look closely, whoever designed this spent a lot of time thinking really hard, because each one of these lines that goes across this midsection is connected to kind of the oppositional form of that identity. So if you have power and privilege up here, the other form of that identity that has less power and is oppressed from an institutional and systemic way is down on the bottom. So let's pull an example just quickly.
Old and ageism.
Yeah, old and ageism. We have cisgender up here, talking about traditional forms of masculinity and femininity, and then gender deviant, which is not a term I personally would use. Maybe gender variant or gender nonconforming, gender queer is down here.
1996, we can cut them a little slack.
Yeah, it's from 1996, exactly. So we're looking at a diagram that these folks pulled together, over 20 years ago. That's accurate, right? Mm-hmm. And it's something that we're still struggling with nationally. I think when we look at what's happening in the news right now, we have to start from square one in this conversation in a lot of rooms. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about that aspect of intersectionality, and we can also talk about a more sophisticated application in the place-based justice network.
Right. Thank you, Erin, for setting up this tool. As you've seen these two images, it's also acknowledging the complexity of who we are as people, who we are as a community, the rich histories, and also what is the collective future that we see. And so when we're talking about privilege, domination, and oppression, we think about how do these things happen in our everyday life? For us, it's really about looking at, for the Center for Community Engagement, we are connected to Seattle U, and we're quasi nonprofit. The way funding is set up is very siloed, but I'm not going to approach my community member here, Erin, and say, hey, Erin, I'm talking to you because you're a female and I got a grant to work with women. But I'm like, Erin, who are you as a community member? Where are we going together? And so I think there are places in our work where these tensions show up, right? So how do we look at, even at the university, in a particular discipline? You're like, oh, you are in anthropology, you are in science. Our work, though, is dynamic. As you can see from this image, you can think about your community members, people that you work with, the issues that they're facing. And when I say issues, I'm talking about how they intersect maybe with the state, right? Whether through criminalization, whether through going through the school system. How does a whole family fit on this wheel, right? How do we look at the collective? And so for us, I really think there are many questions that this image raises for our work. And so really what we want to get into in this next section is, with intersectionality comes intentionality for us. knowing that the current structure that we work in is boxed. It is meant to say, hey, you're working on gender, you're working on race. Oh, the real work of mine is on food. Well, what does that mean? And how do we address the root causes of what we're facing as a community? And so for us as a center, really looking at a neighborhood-based approach, we have to ask ourselves for the whole neighborhood, what does intersectionality mean for us? But also now for us as a network, what does this mean for the network? So we want to open up this conversation and really like focus on our discussion and talk about, you know, how does intersectionality impact how you show up in your work personally? So I'm going to open it up for folks on the phone and for those on video. We're going to spend about 5 minutes. We have a series about 4 or 5 questions that we're going to kind of move through and build upon.
Can I just, this is Heather, hi.
Yes.
I just wanted to, before we keep going, thank you so much for naming that part of this intersectionality is how we interact with the state. Because I'm getting a little bit like ready to see the more like current version of those intersectionality sort of tools that have been around for a while, because I feel like the absence of them naming your documentation status and the absence of them naming your experience with incarceration are really important missing pieces from that have everything to do with our work. And when we overlook that in our work, we're missing some really key, critical, current issues. Anyway, so thank you for naming at least the importance of how we're interacting with the state at a bare minimum.
Yes, thank you, Heather.
So any other reflections on how intersectionality impacts how you show up to the work personally? And by work, we mean place-based community engagement.
This is Kent, and in the other room from AyeNay and Erin here at Seattle U. I would just say for me, the wheel that you presented of the model of sort of different identities, almost all my identities are in the dominant above that axis line. And so what I'm very aware of is there are multiple different things that I'm not seeing or I may not understand. There's a natural tendency to be thinking and judging, but it's a constant effort to try to suspend the lived experience and the way that I would go about making sense of things, to try to listen and understand and have curiosity, which is, I think when I'm at my best, that's where I'm at. When I'm not at my best, I think it can create more struggles.
Thank you, Kent.
I would echo Kent's point in that, like, on my best days, having an awareness of all the different privileges that I'm bringing to the room, and the areas that are sort of not as obvious to people. Like, I can pass as straight, and I do it all the time. But it's sort of an intentional awareness of, and sort of humility around having blind spots. Like, that's really what I'm striving for. At my best, I'm trying to carry an awareness that I'm prone to a whole lot of blind spots. And, you know, knowing that can lead me into a better place with the work, and also an awareness that I'm gonna mess up. I'm gonna run smack into my blind spots sometimes, and like that I need to be prepared to own that.
Mm-hmm.
This is Mary Laurel. I don't think I'm going to be on the screen. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, sorry about that. But it's interesting for me to have started as a young person in this field and now moving into really being an older person to see how that's changed how I do my work and how I'm seen in the world. And so that's one thing I'm thinking about, that I changed you know, on that wheel. I changed as I've gone through working in this neighborhood, in this area. And the other thing I've been thinking about lately, and I don't know if it relates directly, but working with new immigrants and refugees, thinking about how much forgiveness and how much room and space and generosity people offer us, because I think they just how much freedom we get in ways that maybe we shouldn't sometimes, because people are new to this country. So that's something in play that's been really interesting for me to kind of realize lately. And so I just feel the extra privilege and the weight of that for people who, especially the Muslim community and the Somali community that we work with, the East African community, how much they have to put up with, and not so many times they're not able to even say anything because they don't. I mean, I feel uncomfortable saying this, but I feel like people are just learning their rights now and learning like what they shouldn't have to put up with. And so I don't know. I'm just feeling that a lot, right? So I don't know if anyone else has thought about that issue, about kind of the how we're able to, we have extra, I don't know, never mind, I'll stop because I'm kind of balled up here. But anyway.
I connect to that issue too. Mary Laurel's your name?
Yes, uh-huh.
I connect to that issue too. Right now my work has pivoted to be more external facing. Mm-hmm. And so I've been working a lot more with people in the community and getting to know them. And so for me, you know, I know all the statistics of our neighborhood to say, hey, like we have this amount of immigrant and refugee folks. And then now that I get to know people, I get to know their multiple identities, right?
Yeah.
They are not just defined by their state status. Mm-hmm. You know, who are they as a people?
Yeah.
Who are we as a people? And it's really been expanding my mind, you know, in how we name these things, right? How we name people based on state status, which matters, which is why Kimberly Crenshaw wrote this whole body of work as a lawyer, right? How do people interact on these, and how the issues are compounded depending on who you are, right? So for me, it's also intersectionality allows me to keep my openness in people. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I guess what I would add to that is I've been in relationship with people for over 25 years now, and so it's so and deep relationships, not just, you know, like and you know, so it's really amazing to now come to the, I don't know, it's amazing to be in relationship, and I think in hopefully pretty authentic ones, and a lot of respect for one another, and just to watch how this unfolds, and now kind of naming these issues, coming to this really new, and trying to figure out these new ways of thinking about our relationship. So and it would be great to do that with our neighbors too, and our friends in the community. So.
Thank you. That kind of segues us into the next question, really. What might intersectionality mean for local residents and community organizations you work with?
I can share. This is Marie from Loyola University in Baltimore. And I think it's really interesting to work in a neighborhood. For folks who came to Baltimore last summer, we work in one of the most racially segregated neighborhoods in the entire city of Baltimore. And so it's a different audience on both sides of the street, which, yes, one side is predominantly white and one side is predominantly Black. But within those different communities, you have so many different identities. And so it really makes the work complex and interesting. But also the data doesn't show necessarily who lives in those neighborhoods, what they think, what they feel, who they are.
Yes.
And so it's really more important and really more enriching to have conversations with the folks who are in those neighborhoods. And more importantly, to have folks from those neighborhoods across the street from each other talk to each other. And that's really where we see folks coming together and embracing the similarities. I think more often than not, people want to see themselves in each other, but we're so used to othering and saying, oh, well, that's that person over there. But it's really when relationships are developed and people come together that similarities and change can happen.
Yes. Thank you.
You know, one thing I want to point out is there's a number of critiques that white people in particular, or privileged folks in other identities, other racial identities, use intersectionality as kind of a get out of responsibility free card. That's a very wordy way of saying that, but you get what I'm saying. Where, you know, I could look at the forms of oppression that I experience and then really dislocate myself from my whiteness. And the enormous responsibility that comes with the history of whiteness in the United States. And when we're working with local residents and community organizations, specifically people of color, they never forget that I'm white. And I know that now. And I'm aware of that because of my relationships with people of color over the years. And so for me to remember that I'm white, I think is critical in this work. It impacts every conversation that I have with a person of color. It impacts the level of trust I'm able to build. It impacts how much they'll disclose to me about their other identities and their experiences and their stories. And so, yeah, for us as a network to remember, for those of us who are white, to always remember that we're bringing that into this field and into this work, I think is a critical aspect of really applying an intersectional practice.
Thank you for sharing that, Erin. I never forget I'm Black, and I know other people don't forget that I'm Black. But one of the things that I like to use around privilege is that I'm Catholic. Is that my only means of prayer? And am I strict to the Catholic law? No, but I know in Catholic spheres, because I am Catholic, I am able to step in, and that is a vehicle for me to share all of who I am. So I proudly wear the Catholic on me because I'm like, that's my ticket into a space that as a Black, you know, queer woman, I would never be invited to. So I make sure I'm like, I walk around, I'm like, hey, everyone, I'm Catholic, you know? And so I really think with intersectionality, it's like, how do you utilize your privilege in places for community good? How do you think about, you know, these multiple layers of who you are and what comes to the surface and what you hold back? And that is where the power comes in, right? So if we downplay our power, and we don't utilize it in these positional places we can be in and we can inhabit, whether for us as a center or a university or us as an individual, Kent as the executive director, he's able to step into places that I can't get into, right? So I think when you affirm the whole person, and you look at your institution and your organization in this way, and you have these conversations, you're actually able to mobilize as a unit, as a collective. And then when we don't affirm these things, and if we believe in these boundaries and the segregation, right, that is built, that was intentional. How are we intentional to break that apart? Right. And so that's really where our work sits, is with the intentionality to do what? What does place-based justice work mean for you?
So I'm going to take us to our next set of questions. These are our last two questions for discussion, and really shifting to looking at what does this mean for us as a national and international network. We are now officially 12 members deep into forming as a network. I'm really grateful, and we'll poke you more at the end of this call about what that means. But given that this is our first value as the Place-Based Justice Network, what does it look like for us to look at the issues that we're facing as a learning community, as a network, from that intersectional lens? We'd love to hear your thoughts on
that. This is Heather. I was going to mention this in response to the last comments you guys were sharing at the last slide, but it might be relevant to this too. Loyola Marymount University had Ijoma Oluo out last week, who wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, to offer a lecture, which was, earth-shaking in a good way. And she just mentioned almost offhandedly that if you aren't hearing about issues about race within your work and in your the work that you're doing professionally. She wasn't even specifically talking about community engagement or place-based initiatives, but she just mentioned if you're not hearing about that, especially for white people, it's because you've been deemed not safe to approach with those issues. And like you could feel the room kind of take that in. So, and I've been chewing on that for a week, just really deeply. So I feel like that can kind of inform this question too, about this, how, if we are looking from an intersectional lens, how do we take note of how is this network safe enough, or how do we, make a safe enough space to invite the challenges to be discussed. And okay, I'm gonna stop now.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you, Heather, for naming that. I think that's really important. And I think for so many people inside of our network and outside of our network, we are predominantly white. We still are. Our institutions are all predominantly white institutions, and we're conscious of that. And so from the basic structure, we're at a deficit in really approaching this work. And I think that's something that is the forefront of my mind every day too. But, as I think to answer the question from my perspective, our communities have so many different layers of intersectionality, and they're different, and no matter where we are geographically across the United States. But if we're not taking the power lens approach to, I really love this diagram, AyeNay and Erin, because I'd never seen it before. And I think it really clearly names the multiple layers of oppression in ways that is very easy for folks to understand, both individually and then in the context of when universities engage in their communities, because universities and institutions in and of themselves are systems of oppression, and they're set up that way. So even though we say that our aim is through education to empower people, but it oftentimes doesn't happen that way.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Anne Marie from Loyola Chicago. And I'm wondering about that first question, that I do think that intersectionality has a tremendous amount of value for us as a network. But I also think that it would have more value for us in conjunction with the notion of positionality, which I think people have been talking about quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But we haven't named it specifically. but that's what people have been talking about, is like understanding and knowing our positionality and in relationship to our intersectionality, right? So I think those two things together would be a powerful lens as we move forward, knowing where we stand, how we use our positionality in a conscious way, because I want to applaud that notion that we be conscious about what our positionality is, when it comes in handy, and when it gets in our way, when we stumble across it, right? And that we are intentional in using it for the common good, for sure. So that would be kind of something that I'd like to have us think through, bringing a little bit more up to the fore.
Thank you. And then AyeNay is taking down.
Yeah. I'd give you one, but I don't think it'll come through.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
All right.
One of the I'm thinking about, can you hear me? This is Mary Laurel.
Yes.
Yeah. I keep thinking about what students would say about these questions, because as we move towards an institution, our incoming class this year was 57% students of color and first generation students. And they demand this of us, and they deserve that we're coming at this from this lens. You know what I mean? And so and then they also have a lot to say about how they want to be in community related to these issues. So I'd love to hear the student voice, because they're the ones ultimately, besides the institution as a whole, but they're the main ones that are going to be working in this way, you know? And so I think it would be great, really, is there a way for the network to bring in students as a part of this, I guess is what I'm saying, because if we're doing it, I mean, the work involves students mainly. So go ahead.
Thank you for that reminder. And actually, that's a great time to transition to our last section, which is a chance for any of you to pose questions to this group, to the network, either to be addressed right now or for us to consider as a future topic.
I want to kind of also connect what Mary Laurel raises and what Erin O'Keefe was saying. We also have to create the conditions that are going to allow our students to thrive. So if they're out in the community and, you know, we have to do our work as the staff, as the holders, as the leadership of the center and the institution, so they can thrive, right? So it's not telling the students what to do, but how are our systems set up? Is our budget saying what, you know, this is student-led, students doing the work? Is our framing and our collective language, right? So what we're learning here today, that might resonate with us, but what does the language look like in your neighborhood, right? You know, how are people free to speak and interact that will allow the students to actually, you know, be in community? And so I think it's both of those things. It's bringing students into the conversation, and we are in the business of place-based work. So we are creating systems and structures and protocols, and we have to look at all those things at the same time.
Yeah, I really echo that and identify with that, because I think oftentimes, you know, we say that we are working to make change in a place, in a community, and the forethought goes into the students, the programs, the policies and procedures on the internal side, when really a lot of the focus needs to shift externally. And so I think the question that I have are, you know, when it comes to intersectionality, asking of the community, what is it that we don't know yet? Because we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
So, you know, when it comes to data and when it comes to training students or whoever it is that goes beyond campus, I think it's a very one-dimensional picture that we give, and we aren't the people who are able to answer that question. It is the community, they themselves, who should be able to portray that answer. And so our relationships with community members and developing true, real relationships are the only way that any change work can get done.
Right.
Thank you for your comments. Are there additional questions? I really enjoyed the conversation thus far and really appreciate everyone's engagement in this topic. As Erin said, questions for everyone on the group, or any questions around anything you have at this moment. So it's really open to anybody.
I have a question. So I didn't have a chance to introduce myself because I was running late. So my name's Heather Mack. I am actually a consultant with community engagement. I have assessment expertise, so I work with SLCE programs in universities around the country. Anyway, so I'm really trying to learn from place-based initiatives that have been grappling with some critical questions that the sort of larger community engagement field is slowly coming to. Anyway, one of the things that's really surfacing there finally is this false dichotomy between students and the community, when so many of our students are, well, so many of the campuses I work with are regional. So they're first gen, they're living within 5 miles, like they are the community. And so in the community engagement, like strictly like folks that don't have a lot of experience with place-based initiatives, they're sort of stumbling around this question of how to make sense of that and how to break down that dichotomy, showing my ignorance here. Is that something that place-based initiatives have like made sense of and grappled with and like come to like some clarity around?
It's a great question you're raising that I'd like to explore with this network.
I just wasn't sure if that was like oh honey, we've been talking about that for 20 years. Like, you know, like stop wasting our time and go read this.
I think for me, my greatest joy is learning from other universities and learning about the work that they're doing. And so having other universities share some of their work, I think is the benefit of being within this network. I loved last time learning about Seattle U's work and St. Mary's work. So just being able to either highlight, but also ask for help. And I think, you know, I was so busy last summer being a hostess for the network that I didn't really get the opportunity to really solicit feedback from like-minded colleagues, you know, national colleagues. And so I would love to be able to work through either issues or just hear dynamic solutions from my colleagues.
Marie, you are really setting us up for the next part of this conversation, which is an ad to join the network. But I think, Rachel, you want to pose a question?
I was just going to say that's definitely an issue for our campus as well. We're definitely a regional school with more and more students from the local community. So it's something we're starting to think about, but we certainly don't have great wisdom to share at this point. But I think you raise a really important question about when the students are part of the local community and how that interacts for the long term.
It's also so funny to me because it's something that we're all like lifting up at our institution these days. Look at all our first gen students, look at all our diversity. And it's like, but we have work, that just means we have more work to do to like serve these students the way that is going to be best serving them instead of trying to cram them into our like more traditional models we had before.
And I think it matters when we talk about these privilege issues, if we make the assumption that because we're still a predominantly white institution, certainly, but when we make that assumption that for all students going into community engagement activities that they're playing that role, that's different and it's changing, certainly. So we need to be really aware of that.
Yes,
Absolutely.
that's right.
Great. So I think we're about at time to start wrapping up. Karen, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, can you hear me all right now?
Mm-hmm.
So I first want to appreciate our co-facilitators today for an amazing conversation and really thoughtful questions. And I want to go back to this first statement: with intersectionality comes intentionality. And part of what I'm hearing and what I think brings us to this conversation is with place-based work, with the commitments that we've made as a network, comes intentionality. And so I also want to appreciate the visual of that wheel. And I was just picturing myself moving back and forth across it, depending on where I am and how privilege shows up in community meetings. But then when we're talking about transforming the institution, I might feel more marginalized, and how dynamic the work is. And I think that represents how dynamic this network is. So I appreciate you creating a space to hold that dynamism and the complexity of the challenges before us. So I really appreciate that. I also want to remind everybody that the next Zoom call is on Thursday, November the 8th. And that will be facilitated by Chris Nive of University of San Diego and Erin O'Keefe of Loyola Baltimore, to discuss creating space for community voice in our work, which is a nice continuation potentially of this conversation. And then we'll take a break and return in 2019. And as Erin mentioned, the membership is up to 12. You should have received emails about that. If you don't have information about how to join, please contact Erin Burrows. And one of the benefits is to participate with a small team in the winter leadership retreat. The next one is coming up the 12th through the 14th of December at St. Mary's. There you have it on your screen. So we hope to see you there. I think that'll be a dynamic retreat. I've had the privilege of being part of the conversations around what's happening in that retreat. And certainly these Zoom calls are relevant as part of the ongoing leadership conversations, and even the Institute, I think, coming up next summer undoubtedly is informed by these conversations. So I really want to personally thank you for this time in this past hour. I think my take is you've honored the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and provided some really thoughtful questions to call people in to what can be difficult conversations sometimes for folks to enter into. So I appreciate that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
And be on the lookout
Great job, you guys.
with this recording and slides and more resources. We have a couple articles to send everybody.
Yes, articles.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks so much.
Great job.
Good week.